All right, welcome everybody. This is our third installment of the Real Estate Excellence course. We're doing a total of 6. Today is mortgage pre-approval and underwriting Q&A, so I'm really excited for this one. I think there's a lot of stuff that happens on the back end that real estate agents feel is like a big black hole, and we're going to kind of dive deep into that. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone to make a comment so that you are entered into the drawing. We're going to do a gift card giveaway for today's attendees, or if you listen within 48 hours. Today is Thursday, November 2nd, I think. Yes, Thursday, November 2nd. And so we'll do the drawing on Monday for today's class. Then everyone that listens or attends all 6 courses, or all 6 classes, the last one is December 8th. On December 11th, we're going to be doing a drawing, giving away a 2-day vacation up in Bear Lake. I have a cabin up here that you'll be able to stay at, along with a $200 gift card to a local restaurant that's fabulous. So don't forget to comment here. If you're listening to this on YouTube, you need to comment. And if you have kind of a weird handle on YouTube, it's not your name, make sure you put your name so we know who you are and you get credit for being at that class. So I want to introduce, most of you know Tyson. Tyson's going to take a few minutes at the beginning here. Tyson is my loan partner. He's also my son-in-law. We've been working together now about 5.5 years. And Tyson really compliments me because he's super detail-oriented. He has a master's degree in economics, and he is just really, really good at a lot of pieces, putting a lot of pieces, the puzzle pieces together to qualify people. He's the self-employed expert on our team. Honestly, our underwriters love to get our files, but also want to introduce you to Lori Lane. So Lori Lane is one of 3 of our underwriters, and she graciously accepted my nudge invitation to be on this call today. So I've known Lori, oh my goodness, I think it's been 20 years. That I've known Lori, and just FYI, she's probably one of the top, if not the top, USDA underwriters in the state, but she does underwrite all types of loans. So my processor, so we have 3 underwriters, and my processor is one of those 3 underwriters. She just processes for me and underwrites other people's files, but she can't underwrite our files, but she's so good at it that Lori, is it true that you and Denise fight over our files when they get submitted to underwriting?
Yes, there are definitely people that we love to see files from, and you guys are one of those teams.
Right.
So,
And
yay.
And I think that's what's important for everybody to realize, is that there's really a human face, a human person behind every file as far as processing and underwriting go. What's really hard for processing its underwriting is all they know is what they're seeing in the paperwork, right? They didn't have that they weren't part of that initial conversation that you and I usually have with our clients, saying, tell me what your goals are, right? What are you trying to accomplish here, right? Where we really learn about maybe the divorce they went through or situations like that. And so as loan officers, we're basically putting together a story of why we should lend someone $500,000 for 30 years. If you think about that, that's kind of a big deal. And so let's go ahead and, Tyson, why don't you take a few minutes and you talk about the pre-approval process that we go through, and then you guys be thinking of questions that you have for either Tyson about pre-approval or underwriting. I actually had a couple people that are going to have to listen to this, so I've already got a couple questions that people asked me to ask. So Tyson, go ahead and go on your part.
Cool. Yeah, I'll just take a few minutes and kind of walk you guys through what we do when you send us a referral or we start the process with somebody, what those first conversations look like before we actually write a credit approval letter that you can take and make an offer. Let's see. So first, there we go. Okay. So pre-qualified versus pre-approved. This, I don't know if there's like real specific approved definitions of these, but it's kind of, I think, mostly understood that pre-qualified is what you tell me. Like I can have a conversation with someone and they tell me, oh yeah, all this stuff's great. Or pre-approved is a step above. That's what you show me with documentation and everything. And we only write credit approval letters, and I think most lenders, it's the same deal, after a pre-approval, right? After we've seen documentation. So just a few examples. I have good credit scores. How many times have we all heard that? And then I pull a credit report and it's 680, which is not bad. Like we can work with that for a lot of loan programs, but you know, sometimes people think they have much better credit scores than they do, or a big one, self-employed, and we'll talk about that just a little bit. You know, hey, I made 200 grand last year, but once I get their tax returns, it might show something different, right? So that's why it's important to actually go through a pre-approval and not just believe everything the borrower says. Not that they're intentionally lying, but they just don't understand what we have to do as mortgage people in order to count qualifying income. So what is needed for a pre-approval? There's a few things. So first, employment and income. So they have to have an employment history. There's a lot of things that fall into that. In some cases, we can use college as their employment history, but what type of income is really important. If it's salary, that's really easy. W-2 salary income is easy breezy, but if they're self-employed or they have, you know, if they're older and they get Social Security or retirement income, there's a lot of different factors that could play into that. Assets. So how are they going to buy this house? With down payment or closing costs, different asset types have different rules that we can use. You know, cash in a savings account, super easy, but you know, 401k withdrawal or a gift, you know, there's some nuances there. Credit report and liabilities. So when we pull a credit report, we get the credit scores, which is really important, but we also see all the liabilities. Do they have student loans that are in deferment? That could play into it. And then just any of the other, you know, car loans, credit cards, stuff like that. Okay, and then we go through all the scenarios. You know, with the income and the liabilities, we calculate their DTI, their debt to income ratio. We look at loan programs they qualify for, and then run AUS, which is automated underwriting, which is basically just we put in all the inputs, all the information we have at the time, and it spits out an initial approval, and there's some conditions and things in there that we can work with. So I like to go through all of this before we write a credit approval letter, and sometimes more. And I'm just going to show a quick flow chart, a couple quick flow charts, and then I'll be done. But this is like ideal scenario, right? We have a phone call, they fill out the application, they submit their income and asset documents. For a simple scenario, that's pay stubs, W-2s, bank statements. And then we can write our credit approval letter after we run AUS, run the credit report. If everything checks out, I've done this in 20 minutes before, right? If they fill out the application so I can pull credit and send me their documents, I can look it over and say, yep, you're good to go. Okay, that's an easy scenario. But let's do that again, but let's make it complicated. So we still have the phone call, they fill out the application, but somewhere between what they fill out on the application and the phone call, we find out they've got self-employed income, maybe they have some rental properties. So now their income and asset documents are a lot more, right? Maybe I need tax returns, maybe I need a 401k statement, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times if they have variable income, meaning, you know, maybe they get commissions that are seasonal or a bonus that's biannual, or, you know, there's a million different scenarios. Anything that's not consistent, a lot of times I will get a VOE or a verification of employment where I'm actually going to the employer to have them give me all the details on their income. And that helps us get a good income calculation. Depending on the scenario, even after that, sometimes I'm going to send it to an underwriter and say, I want you to review the income so that, you know, I'm not making mistakes up front. We want to know for sure that this income is good to go. And then while all that's happening, you know, maybe we pull a credit report and there's some debt payoff that we need to talk about. They need to improve their scores. And I may still write a credit approval letter while we're in the middle of them paying off debt. It just depends on how we feel about it and how committed they are to doing it. But we want to have those conversations and make sure they understand what needs to be done before closing. Okay, and then asset verification, again, maybe there's a 401k or a gift letter or something we have to talk about there. And then once all of that is done, that's when we can write a credit approval letter. So easy scenario could happen same day, right? Something like this might take a week, right? If the employer is not getting back to us to get their verification of employment, we'd have to bug them. Anyway, ideally it doesn't take that long, but just so you guys understand that if it is a complicated scenario, we promise we're working on it, but sometimes it does take time. But the trade-off is, we spend the time to do it up front, and then you're confident going forward that this deal's not going to fall apart once they're under contract. So that's how I personally like to do it. Some other lenders might have a different scenario where like, hey, just get under contract and then we'll figure it out. But that gives me ulcers, so I don't like to do it that way. I like to make sure we're good to go up front so that the rest of it is easy. Spend a little more time up front. So that's all I had on that.
I love that. Thank you, Tyson. He's so good at making these charts. Like, it's really visual to see kind of if it's a complicated situation, there's a lot that goes into what we do. And I know a lot of people get frustrated with the mortgage process. In fact, Lori, I was talking to a realtor yesterday, and this was such an interesting question. And I hope you don't mind that this is the first question, right? Basically, this realtor was like, why? I have clients that they give all the information to their lender, and you have to understand some realtors don't have any control over who their buyer goes to. It might be a lender they've never even heard of, right? And they keep asking for more documentation constantly. And then the underwriter comes back with conditions, they give them that stuff, and then the underwriter comes back and asks for more. Now, I have my opinion on how to answer that question, but Lori, I would love your perspective as an underwriter when it comes to conditions and reviewing what people send in. Why then is underwriting asking for more stuff?
Well, it's kind of an interesting idea. I mean, ideally, like you said, we like to take care of as much, you guys like to take care of as much up front so that there's less surprises down the road. We're trying to do the exact same thing. The underwriter, the more we have at the beginning, the more fleshed out and full detailed picture that we're going to have as we're trying to make an underwriting decision. Now, every time that we get a new piece of documentation, we have to analyze that, add it to the equation. And sometimes that piece of documentation that you present to us will open more questions. Like, say you give me a pay stub and all of a sudden I've got a child support deduction coming off a pay stub. Well, okay, well, now I have to ask about, okay, well, is there a divorce decree? Because obviously there's a debt there that needs to be considered. Or if you give me a bank statement and all of a sudden there's a really large deposit. Okay, well, now I have to look and say, okay, is that an additional debt that needs to be considered? Or, are they laundering money? Something like that. And we have to ask those questions. So unfortunately, follow-up conditions occur. But obviously, for myself and probably the other two underwriters at Security Home, we like to mitigate that as much as possible. We hate to add new conditions to files because, again, we feel like it's just, every time you guys give a file to us, we're, smacking it back to you. And, we obviously want that process to go as smoothly as possible. Yeah, so, but that's where when we have to add those, obviously there's a legitimate need, but we don't really love to do that. So,
yeah. Well, and lots of things can happen during the couple weeks of a loan process. As you guys know, we pull credit right before closing, and we just had to re-pull credit right before closing for someone that's approved. All of a sudden, his mortgage doesn't show up on the new credit pull. Well, we know what that means. It means that his servicing was sold, and there's this little window of time where neither mortgage will show up because we know that's what happens. But now we have to get a mortgage statement from the new servicer just to prove, because if he did pay off that mortgage, we have to prove where he got $180,000 between last week and this week, right? And so, yeah, any new piece of documentation or event during the process, everything is analyzed. Sherry Lynn asked a great question.
Okay.
She said, what's the correct wording for how you pre-approve? Oh, this is for our pre-approval letter. I want to let sellers know you've done a more in-depth pre-qual and not a basic one. So great question, Sherry. Tyson and I, in our credit approvals, we state that they are credit approved, and we have reviewed asset income and credit report and asset and income. So we list, and then we state if we have run automated underwriting. And so we kind of go in depth, and then we also offer a $1,000 guarantee to the seller that the loan will close. So as long as the buyer does his part, there's not a problem with the property that we don't know about. We guarantee that credit approval. So that seems to work really well.
And then
Okay.
we also call the listing agent, right? And have a conversation with them and say, hey, this is what we did. This is why we feel really good about it. You know, it's a straightforward scenario, or it's a little complicated, but I already talked to my underwriter about their income. So yeah, that conversation I feel is really helpful. If they don't answer the phone, I'll either send them a text or like a voice memo through their text just to explain everything.
Yeah, and Sherry, you're right. Those calls make all the difference. And especially now that so many agents in our area know Security Home Mortgage. We've been around forever. They know my name or Tyson's name. Sellers and realtors get really nervous when their buyers are working with an out of state or an online lender, right? So we try to mitigate those fears and try to let them know that we're going to stay in touch. Okay, so now the next question I have is about ADUs. And I know recently FHA changed their rules about rental income, and this is actually a pretty big deal. Lori, can you kind of explain what that means now with someone that's buying a house with an FHA loan that has the mother-in-law apartment, what that means now?
Okay. This is actually one that I was super excited about because for years, I've kind of, personally on my little soapbox felt that it's really unfair that you can have this separate dwelling that we know everybody's renting them, but they don't get the benefit of that rental income. So I was really excited when FHA came out and announced that they will allow us to count some of that rental income, because it really gives your borrower a more room to purchase a home that they can feel comfortable in. So with the ADU income, FHA is now allowing us to use a rent comparable schedule for that unit. So for that mother-in-law apartment.
Does. So
yeah, so we get a market comparable from the appraiser that says, hey, for the market, you could rent this apartment for $1,000. So then at that point, we can now use 75% of that rental amount as income for the borrower in the transaction. We can't directly offset the payment, but we can use it as income. So then that can improve or increase your borrower's purchasing power. Now, there are a few small requirements to go with that. They do want a couple of months reserves. They want us as a lender to verify that it's legal with the city, which, is kind of a no-brainer. We want to make sure that, they're not doing something that could get them in hot water with the city. And then
Lori, on that, my understanding was because I think it was in 21 or 22 when Governor Cox came out, and he basically said that as a state, we are allowing ADUs. And so there's still some cities that are kind of battling that, but I think for the most part, most cities are pretty much on board with that. And I don't think that's too tough to get. But again, if I were a listing agent and I was listing a property that was say under 600,000, I would go as a listing agent, I would go and call the city and just say, hey, this is the property address. There is a mother-in-law apartment. Is that approved as an ADU? And I would jot down who you spoke to and what they said. So then you've got that information, and you can even put that into your remarks of the MLS. So
yeah. And most of the time, I'm at least, in my personal experience, when you call the city, they're pretty easy to talk to, and they usually know exactly. You give them the address and they tell you exactly what you're looking at. So that's a great, but that's a great thing that they're opening that up for these borrowers. So I think that was pretty much it that I could think of on the ADU. They do have a little caveat that you can't use the rental income from the ADU can't be more than 30% of the borrower's qualifying income. But I don't really think that that's going to come into play too often. just because of the size of most of these homes with the ADUs, I don't think we're going to run into that problem.
Yeah. And Sherry made a note that there's restriction for lot size and separate entrance. And yeah, I mean, it can't be that you put in a microwave and a hot plate in your basement and you call that an ADU. That wouldn't work, right? It does have to have a separate.
Yeah, it has to have its it has to have its own little independent living space. Like you can't have to go through, the one house to get to the other. It has to have a separate, ingress, egress, those kinds of things. And then it does have to have, the separate, kitchen facilities, bathroom, bedroom, all those things. And your appraisers, they'll note all of that in the report that we get.
And when Lori said one of the requirements is extra reserves, what that means is they have to, let's say their house payment's going to be $3,000 a month. After closing and all the money needed for closing, down payment and closing costs, they have to have $6,000 available as assets just in a reserve account. So most people have a 401k. And in that scenario, as long as they had $6,000 in their 401k, I'm sorry, $12,000, because we can use 50% of a 401k for reserves, they would meet the $6,000 reserve requirement. And so just FYI, those are just kind of the rules going around that. And Brian just asked, does every city have different rules? Or is there a general guideline? And Sherry responded, she was surprised that Saratoga Springs had a map. Most cities are just following new guidelines. And that's an evolving thing. So I imagine that this topic within cities and counties is going to evolve because we're all trying to, I mean, the whole purpose of the governor coming out with a statewide mandate or whatever you want to call it was that we need to do things to help with the housing crisis, and that it's definitely one way to help. But on our end, it's absolutely one way to help someone qualify. If they can rent it for $1,000 and we can add $750 to their income, you would be amazed how just a little bit sometimes makes all the difference in qualifying. So that's fabulous. All right, drop my pen. Thanks, Lori. Appreciate it on that one. All right.
Well, one note on that. Doesn't Fannie and Freddie also allow that now?
Yes, they have different requirements, and I'm not as well versed in those because I mean this has been a hot topic, so I've looked at it a bunch. But they do also allow that, so there are options for conventional in addition to FHA.
And that was just this year as well, right? That they made that change?
Yes. Earlier this year, Freddie came out with it. Fannie's guidelines are a little more vague, but Freddie's are very, very clear, and they're similar in that they will allow that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I think everyone's trying to kind of get on board with how to help the housing crisis in a sustainable way that's not going to cause foreclosures down the road, right? They always have to weigh that balance out. And if you think about it, that's really what the underwriter is doing. They're trying to make sure that down the road, there isn't a reason that we know now that this person won't be able to afford that house down the road. So I actually want to talk a little bit about variable income, because a lot of times, in fact, 99% of the time, people say, I work full time, and they're hourly. And I always ask for 2 pay stubs, because hopefully what we look for on 2 pay stubs is there 40 hours a week, so 80 hours on each pay period. And when I take the year to date and divide it, does that equal out to what it should be? And I think, Laura, you and I have had this conversation. A lot of times, if they are paid hourly, they truly do not always work 40 hours a week. And so we have to average their income, and it can bring their income down a lot. Lori, can you explain how you look at that and what are the red flags with variable income? Because I think as realtors, when you're talking to people and you find out about their jobs, this is just good for you to know. Not that you're ever going to use the information to run the numbers. It's just good for you to understand why sometimes some income is more difficult to use and we don't get as much income to qualify people. So go for it, Lori.
Well, and I think in this situation, where you're talking about those follow-up conditions that you're getting, I think this is, especially for right now, this has been a really hot topic with all of, FHA, not so much VA, but FHA and conventional loans. This has been a real hot button for them. We always laugh because they kind of come up with a flavor of the month of what they hit. And variable has definitely been the flavor of the month. And it's really hard, especially for me as an underwriter to put my, I try to keep my own personal spin out of it. Personally, I'm like, okay, variable income, it's really hard. especially when I can see if there's been consistent earnings. Obviously we want to make that work. And like Bliss mentioned, if the year-to-date average supports what we're using, then as an underwriter, I have no problem going forward. But if some of the red flags that we do see is if you have somebody who says, okay, yeah, I'm working 40 hours a week, I'm making X amount of dollars an hour, so $5,000 a month, and I calculate out their year-to-date average and say it's only a couple $1,000s a month, well, then now at that point, it falls on us we have to document why there's such a severe increase. And we actually see this more than you would think. So at that point, as an underwriter, I'm gonna go back and ask for, okay, did they receive any raises in the last 12 months? And most of the time the employer will come back and say, oh yeah, they got a $3 raise in March and a $2 raise in August. And I can say, oh, okay, if I take, go back to the base of their base rate of pay at the beginning of the year and times it out, oh, that supports with the average. And then I can use the higher amount. And I know I'm kind of
No, it's good. But
speaking circles, I mean, it makes sense in my head. I talk to people and then I realize, oh, well, this doesn't make sense to everyone because it's kind of, it's mortgage lingo and that's kind of hard. But if I can justify or document a reason to use the higher income, I'm always going to want to do that. And for most people, just getting the documentation to support raises is sufficient. But sometimes, let's say your borrower has only worked there for a couple months, hasn't received any raises. Sometimes we will have to go back to a previous employer because with variable income, we are required to document 12 months worth of receipt for most loan types. So sometimes I'll have to go back to a previous employer and say, okay, were they doing the same job? What was their pay there? So that I can justify, using that variable income.
And
Is that kind of answer it?
That is great. And so let's say they worked 6 months out of the last year at a job where they made $5 less an hour. We're going to look at the number of hours they worked, not the income. And so
yes.
we can use, let's say they're currently making $25 an hour and they've averaged 35 hours a week for 12 months. We're going to take it at their current pay. So we give them as much benefit as we can. And a lot of times that's also why we will ask for 12 months worth of pay stubs. I have a kid right now that broke his arm on the job and was off for a while, and he switched jobs about 10 months ago. So I actually have gotten about 18 months worth of pay stubs because I also need to be able to use overtime. And that's a lot of paperwork, right? And so as real estate agents, what I like to point out here, what helps us is if you set the stage with your clients, not even with specifics, but if you just say, sometimes going through that lending process and the underwriting process can be frustrating, and they're probably going to get your initial documents and then ask you for more. So just understand now you're probably going to feel frustrated at some point, but in the end, it's going to be worth it to be able to buy this house. So you're just this third party from the mortgage world, right? You're saying that to them as their friend. That sets the stage so that when we do frustrate them, and I guarantee you at some point we're probably going to frustrate them, right? They're going to be, oh, that's right, Shelly told me, in the back of their mind, Shelly told me I was going to get frustrated. I'm frustrated. It's okay. It's going to be worth it in the end. And so it just makes, you would be amazed when you guys have those conversations, how that changes people's perspective when they're working with us. So that's something I just put on your to-do list, right? Okay. All right, Lori, next one. So this is actually from an underwriter that has gotten some personal loans, and it's been a really big struggle because, of course, as a real estate agent, they're self-employed. They can write off a lot of stuff. And she said, I've done loans where sometimes I had to give 2 years tax returns. Sometimes I only had to give 1 year tax returns. Why is it different? And why is it so hard when you're self-employed? So 2 separate questions. Let's start with why sometimes 1 year and why sometimes 2 years?
Okay, with that, a lot of it depends on the automated underwriting system that we use and whether or not it determines the risks factors warrant getting 1 year or 2 years. And whether or not the business has been in existence is a player into that. If they've had it for a year or two, you're probably going to have to give us the full time worth of tax returns versus if they've had it for 10 years, obviously that's going to be a positive in their risk assessment, and you will probably only have to provide one. So it mostly just depends on the loan type, and other factors that go into that. Your DTI, or your debt to income ratios, your credit scores, things like that are going to determine whether or not you need 1 year or 2 years.
So it could really, if you're a real estate agent and you got a loan 3 years ago and you only had to do 1 year then, there could be some things change that if you go to do a loan now, you may need to do 2 years, right?
Yes, and that's really the hard thing to explain to a lot of people, because in our industry the rules are constantly changing, and we're trying to hit a moving target, and so the investors are constantly expanding and contracting their guidelines, and that's especially something that we have seen with COVID. They shrunk down the guidelines, and they made it really super difficult for self-employed borrowers to get financing, and we're slowly seeing a relaxation of those guidelines to everyone's relief, to make it easier and for those borrowers to get a home loan. So hopefully we'll continue to see that.
I think one of the changes you mentioned at our staff meeting earlier this morning is that, so Fannie and Freddie are both conventional loans, but they have different rules. And Freddie has always required that if you get a 1 year tax waiver, it's only if you have been in the business for 5 years, owned your business for 5 years. Fannie didn't have that requirement. So you could have owned your business for 3 years and we could get a 1 year tax waiver. So most self-employed borrowers, we actually took Fannie. It was a little bit easier path for a couple of reasons. January 1, correct me if I'm wrong, Lori, January 1, we're changing that now on any 1 year waiver, Fannie or Freddie, we have to prove that you've owned the business for 5 years.
Yes,
now,
that's correct.
People will incorporate their business. And so on their tax returns, on their corporate returns, it will show incorporated January 1st, 2020. But prior to that, they did a Schedule C. And so we would just have to prove some way that that business had been operating more than 5 years. Like as a real estate agent, I have real estate agents that run all of their business through a Schedule C, and I have some that do it through a corporation. So all of that's workable. Just the more information we have up front, the easier it is. So that's great answer on that question, Lori.
Now there was a second part to your question.
Yeah. So the second question is why is it so hard to get a loan when you're self-employed? Good luck with that.
Oh, I'm so glad that they have recently started relaxing the guidelines, because for a while there, it was really hard, especially, as an underwriter, they like to put a lot back on us, and they use this term that I just love, that's called underwriter's discretion, which basically means that they don't give us any guidelines, and it's 100% up to us to determine the risk, and it lands on us and on our company for that risk factor. Basically, we don't have any kind of reps or warrants or anything to stand upon. So that's why self-employed is difficult, just because there's so much that goes into determining, whether or not the company is liquid. Does it have which means basically, does it have the assets to pay the debts, in addition to the borrower's pay and salary, and that's something that a lot of people don't really understand, that we have to verify. So when we start asking for bank statements, 3 months worth of bank statements from the business, and profit and loss and balance sheets, most of the time that liquidity is what we're trying to document. So we have to document that the income is being received, that it's stable and likely to continue, and that the company is also liquid. So that stable and likely to continue is where a lot of people, get frustrated, because they're like, well, if I've been doing this for 5 years, of course it's going to continue. So that's where we ask for profit and loss and balance sheets and things like that, to support that the company is still making the money that it is. And especially with COVID, that became really important, because a lot of businesses were seeing a general decline in their income. So we want to make sure that that decline is no longer occurring, and that we're on an upward trend with the business, and that it's healthy and able to sustain a debt, for the home, and to continue to operate.
Declining income is a huge thing, whether you're hourly and year to date is less than last year when we calculate it out, right? Or your overtime that we want to use is less this year than it was last year. If you're self-employed and 2021 was 100,000 and 2022 was 80,000, declining income, the underwriter says, is it going to keep declining to zero? So again, I can't Lori can't come out and say, we need X, Y, and Z, because until we see their scenario, we don't even know what to ask for, right? How can we prove that it's not declining? And because what are the statistics? Like 50% of all small businesses go out of business within the first 2 years, and 90% within the first, I don't know the exact, it's a huge amount, and not all the time because they weren't profitable. Sometimes people just say, I don't want to do this anymore, right? But it's a huge responsibility, because let's say our underwriters basically approve a file. In 3 years or 5 years or 10 years from now, they default on Lori, they default
I laugh.
on it. Lori, can you explain what happens when a default happens, what they come back to you and ask for?
Yeah. So a lot of people, like you said, once we close, it's out of sight, out of mind for most people that are involved with the transaction. And for us, the underwriters specifically, like myself personally, I wear a lot of hats at Security Home. I did QC for a number of years. And in addition to that, I handled all of our audits. And those loans, they hang around for us for years. So it can be something as simple as within a couple weeks of closing, an investor that they may come back and say, hey, we noticed that you missed this. So can you provide us with an updated document? So we may have to go back to your borrower within a couple of weeks of closing and ask for some follow-up documentation. And most of the time, that's just something that, maybe something that they've added that's new, or something, heaven forbid, that we as an underwriting processing team that maybe we missed. So that occurs. But then from there, that loan, after we close it, it gets sold to an investor who holds it long term, but then it also goes to whoever's insuring that loan. So Fannie, Freddie, FHA. So then they also will audit that loan. And for if any reason they miss a payment, or sometimes even if they don't miss a payment, the audits that occur, they will go on for years and years and years. And unless you mentioned 10 years, I actually had one come back that was 15 years old. And, I've been working at Security Home personally for 20 years. So when I got this loan and I'm like, okay, this happened before I even started working here, and I had to go back and try to research, and obviously at that point, we can't really ask the borrower for more documentation, but those loans do hang around for a really long time, and they do get scrutinized over and over and over and over and over again, based on their loan performance or risk portfolio, or every time that loan gets sold to a different, bank, they can raise questions every single time. So obviously, and as far as the default process goes, if a loan is determined to be in default, and if they determine that there is fraud, I know personally for Security Home, there comes times when we have to buy those mortgages back. So the company will literally purchase the mortgage loan back, and whether or not we can adjust it, refinance it, scratch and dent it, however, or service it, that does happen on occasion. So our liability is very, can be pretty big. So that's another reason why sometimes at underwriting, it may seem like we're being really overcautious or scrutinizing, is like Bliss mentioned earlier, you guys are presenting a story to us, and we have to look at the black and white on the paper and try to make a determination of whether or not the risk and the collateral are worth the long-term investment for the company. And so that's really hard for us sometimes, because sometimes we look at it and say, well, this is, I always tell, like pessimism versus optimism versus realism. And underwriters kind of fall in that realism/pessimistic view. We want to make sure that the loan is going to be profitable and good for the company. Because obviously, we all want to do loans. We all want to help people get homes so that we can all stay in business and help people at the same time. So, but that's long-term life of it.
Well, I remember when I first started doing loans, so like 1990 something, and I literally walked into my underwriter's office and I said, but he's a really nice guy. That was my only argument for her conditions. He's a really nice guy. And it was true. But I still remember that. And she laughed maniacally at me.
And it's hard because we know that every borrower is nice and they're all wonderful, and that they all have the intention of making their house payments and, and being a responsible homeowner. And sometimes just on paper, sometimes it's reflected and sometimes it's not. And so that's where we have to make our story as strong as possible, because we're going to hand it off to somebody else who's going to read that and make that determination as well. So
there are actually people that get mortgages and never make a payment.
yes.
And so there are some crazy stories in the mortgage world. Keith asked a really good question. What happens if they can't provide the needed documentation post-closing? So post-closing conditions are my least favorite thing. They do come about maybe between 5 and 8% of the time. 99.9%, in fact, 100% for me, because I've never had a problem. I've always been able to get documentation sufficient for the investor, right? Or for the audit, always. In that 0.1%, that goes back to what Lori said, we would be required to repurchase the loan back. And now we have a loan that we can repackage and possibly sell to another investor. But what if rates went up? We have to honor that original interest rate. So then we do service some loans, so we may service it. The other thing Lori mentioned was the scratch and dent market. That's basically people that buy loans 50 cents on the dollar. And so if we had to pay $300 to take, $300,000 to take that loan back, we might be able to sell it for 150,000. So we just lost 150,000. So there is some really, really big risk. And Lori mentioned at underwriter's discretion. Boy, that's just a hard thing, right? Because he is a nice guy, or whatever the case might be. But again, we're putting together a story. So adding more documentation, getting more verification of assets or letters of explanation are a big thing. You know, I know most of you on here have gotten a loan. Some of you have gotten a loan with us. You know, we have a lot of letters of explanation that we have you sign. So for example, I have a guy that had kind of a large house. He has, I think, 5 kids, and he was buying a townhome. It was a good sized townhome. It was, I think, 4-bedroom with an unfinished basement townhome. And the question is owner occupancy. He was only putting 5% down. He wasn't selling his current home before buying the townhome. And so the underwriter says, you know, this could be occupancy fraud. He could be doing this to buy a rental property with just 5% down, which is an extremely high risk. And so we had him write a letter, and it was a fabulous letter. He basically said, I hate yard work. And my kids are at an age where they're involved in so many activities. We want to spend our time with our kids. This townhome is right by the high school. We, as a family, have decided we would rather live in a smaller place for better quality of life at the stage we're at. Underwriter said, perfect, signed it off, right? But without that letter of explanation, it's a really big red flag. So Lori, last question that I had on my list is, what are some red flags that you see that you question? That you might, things you might want more documentation on, things that in your experience have seemed a little fishy. Help us understand that so we know what to look for.
Okay, so you've covered a couple of those. Occupancy is obviously a big thing. We have to have it has to make sense. And again, like you said, you're the one that's sitting with the borrower. They tell you the story and you understand the nuances of the situation, and the underwriter on paper doesn't always understand that. So that's where those letters of explanation. So sometimes something that may make sense to you as the real estate agent, or even as the loan officer, is not coming through to the file. So that's where those like you say, red flags may come in. Lots of red flags. We talked about like inconsistent earnings, like with where their pay varies, or if they're employed by family. That's been a really big red flag lately. We may ask for more documentation on that. What other red flags? I'm trying to think off the top of my head, because we've covered a lot of them. Like I said, the earnings and the.
I have one. In fact, this was Sherry. This was your someone you referred to me. He's a pilot. And his last 2 years earnings have been really, really high. And if I just took his W-2 and averaged his income, it was fabulous. My debt to income was so low. But when we looked at his pay stub, I forget the exact wording, but there was like a $40,000 bonus, and I got his year-end pay stub for the year before, and there was a $30,000 bonus for the year before. And the way the wording did not say retention bonus, but it was some phrasing where the underwriter said, We need to know what that is and if it's likely to continue. Come to find
Yes.
out, that was a retention bonus and he would only get it for a third year. So if income has to be likely to continue for 3 more years in order for us to use it. So we had to take that out of his income. Same thing on like child support and alimony.
Yep. I was going to say that's a very common, we see it a lot with child support and alimony where
Yeah, can
people
you
will.
go into detail real quick on that, Lori? What you look at in a divorce decree to determine if we can use alimony and child support?
Yeah, so divorce decrees, we read through them, and obviously any subsequent additions or amendments to those decrees, and we look at the age of the children and how long the child support is going to continue. So based on, and some divorce decrees will spell it out really clearly, and they'll say, hey, they're going to pay X amount with this until this date, and X amount till this date, and X amount till this date. Other ones are a little more vague, where they'll just say, the child support will be adjusted as each child turns 18 or graduates from high school. And so sometimes we'll have to ask for further documentation on that to verify that that income will continue. Same thing with alimony, has to be continuing for 3 years for us to use it for qualifying income. And that applies to most income sources. If we know that it has a curtailment date, like you said with your gentleman, where he's only going to be getting that income for the one more time, then we wouldn't be able to use that for qualifying. So we want to, like I said, a lot about it comes down to whether it's stable, likely to continue. So if I see something that doesn't look like it's stable, like you talked about, declining income is a huge red flag. Because we have to verify, why is it declining? Is it going to continue to do so, or has it recovered? So for example, I just did a loan for a gentleman where they work in a food industry for a restaurant, and their income, he'd been typically making about $3,000 a month, and I get his last 2 pay stubs and he's only made about $800. So I see this huge decline and say, okay, well, your year-to-date average supports $3,000. Why are you now only making $800 a month? Well, come to find out, he had started working at a different restaurant for the same family, but a different restaurant. And so his hours at that restaurant had dramatically increased. So his pay was increasing there, but his other income was declining. So we had to put that in letters and explain it so that we could source and say, okay, hey, his increase over here is justified and his decrease over here is justified and it's stable, and he's going to continue to receive both those streams of income. So declining income is a really big red flag. And then I was going to talk about, some red flags on properties. I know we see this a lot, and some frustrations, especially from real estate agents, when we start asking about private property that's included in contracts, carpet allowances, things like that. We are bound by certain rules from the investors, especially like when it comes to personal property. If it's something that's likely or common for the area to be left, like in Utah, a lot of people leave their appliances, like Bliss mentioned, somebody downsizing, okay, I don't want my trampoline anymore, those kinds of things. If they're commonly left at the property, we can assume, or, we can get an addendum that just says it adds no value, and that's common. Now, if it's more of a situation where somebody's vacating a home and they're leaving all of their furniture and everything like that, that's not so common. So in that situation, we may ask for more documentation from the loan officer and hence the realtor on those situations. And then as far as like carpet allowances and things like that, if there's direct incentives being given to the borrower, we have to deduct those as oh crap, and my brain just went dead. I can't remember the word, but basically we have to deduct it out of the purchase price because they're inducements to purchase the home. So that's another thing that's really hard for people to understand.
And that's why we do it as seller pay closing costs, right?
Yes. So if we move it to seller pay closing costs, and that's that was something I was going to mention earlier, especially with like the follow-up conditions and stuff. We have a lot of experience at Security Home in kind of our collective body. And we find a lot of workarounds and ways for us to solve problems that may not just be straightforward solutions. I know a lot of times if we have a problem loan or something like that, or a situation, we will everybody, the management team at Security Home will get together with the loan officers and the other underwriters, and we'll sit and we'll kind of kick around loans and find ways that we can solve problems and get them done. And that's one thing that I personally love as an underwriter is I have 2 other underwriters at my disposal that I can say, hey, I'm seeing this. What have you typically seen in the past? Do you have any experience with this? And same with the management at Security Home. They've been around for a really long time. And so it's fantastic to have that brain trust behind us to be able to solve those problems and make deals work. And a lot of times we can come up with some good solutions that work for the borrowers and get the deal done. So that's one thing that I love at Security Home.
And Keith actually asked a great question. And yeah, Tyson answered basically, what about a fully furnished cabin property or an Airbnb that someone's buying as an investment property? And we actually, Tyson just had that. And so we just said, you need to do the furnishings on a separate bill of sale for $1. And the property is because we can't give a 30-year mortgage to a couch. Because, my grandma's
that couch can sprout legs and walk off at any time. So
it's not permanent. That's actually, I always said because it wouldn't last 30 years, but that's actually a better perspective. It's not part of the property, right?
Yeah, if it's not attached to the property, it can't be included as part of the collateral because it can be disposed of.
And do a separate bill sale. So great question. So we are almost out of time. Anybody have any other questions? So I'll just watch here for another minute or so, but Lori, I appreciate your time and your expertise. I know when I have questions, it's just so easy for me to either pick up the phone or shoot a quick email out to my underwriting team, and getting answers right away to underwriting questions. I think we mentioned this. It was in a class Tyson taught this week, but so every loan is going to have a problem with the property, the borrower, something, right? Problems are very, very easy to solve the first week of a transaction or before they go under contract, if it's something with their situation. Something that pops up at the time of underwriting now has become a crisis, and everybody's stress level goes through the roof. Now, there'll be times when that happens, like unforeseen things, but I would say 90% of all problems can be worked out if you get the correct documentation up front. And so most of the time when people talk about their frustrations on a transaction or with a lender, it's usually because of that. But I also know that I think Sherry stepped off. Sherry and I had a transaction one time where it was a jumbo loan, and jumbo loans have a requirement of 6 months reserves. And I know that if you ask me that question, do jumbo loans require reserves? I would say yes. Well, for some reason, all the way through that transaction, I completely forgot about it, and they didn't have it until right before underwriting. We realized it, and we were able to go and be extremely creative. Like, we're talking creative stuff I've never done before to make that deal work, and it did work. But we don't. That's not how we don't want my stress level, because I don't usually make mistakes like that. My stress level was on another planet. And that's why we work so hard with our team to make sure we solve all the problems up front so that the loan process is as smooth as possible. So yeah, we appreciate you guys being here today. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to make a comment. And in 2 weeks, our next Q&A will be property flip. No, Airbnb. Nope. Yeah, short-term rentals. I'm sorry. My brain is crazy. Sherilyn Ramsey and Carla Patton, who have both bought, managed, and sold short-term rentals, are going to be on here for your Q&A. So I'm really excited about that one, whether it be for you personally or for you to be able to answer your clients' questions. So thanks, guys. Yes, 2 weeks. Next week, I'm at a conference in California, so we're taking a break next week. So it is on the 16th, if I remember correctly, Thursday the 16th at 10 o'clock in the morning. And we'll send everybody reminders, okay? All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Sherry, so glad you made it.